Hello, Derek and Danny.
Hello, Bob. How are you
Hello,
doing?
Bob.
I'm doing fine. I'm glad we're all so cordial and chipper, as is our nature. So I'm Robert Wright of the Nonzero podcast, and our bold experiment in podcast synergy continues with the co-host of the American Prestige podcast, Danny Bessner, and Derek Davison. We did one of these, as it happens, 2 months ago, right before the Hamas attack. And so we scurried to tape and add a little kind of prelude that accounted for that, and wound up with a pretty long podcast, among other things.
So you're welcome, audience.
Yeah, really. One shudders to think of what might happen now that will require us to come back.
Yeah, let's don't jinx it. Maybe we should never record another podcast again.
It's going on top. I think I forgot the statistic, but an incredibly high number of podcasts have one episode.
Is that right?
Yeah. It's like way higher than you'd think, because obviously there was this podcast boom, which has decidedly ended.
Yeah.
And so, a lot of people tried to do their own thing, and it just petered out after an episode. Because
but only the strong survived.
That's the conceit of the episode 1 podcast, which is a very funny podcast
E1.
that people should listen to. E1.
Yeah, it's a very good podcast.
Oh, there's a podcast called E1?
Yeah,
they do these like skits of podcasts that failed, basically, like the one episode of some ridiculous.
It's a really good idea.
So it's really funny.
It's like the Wayne's World of podcasting, kind of.
Yeah,
is that reference too old for you guys?
No, I love Wayne's World.
Not for me. I'm an old person, so
it's one of my favorite movies. It's unbelievably good. The first Wayne's World movie, the second one's really good too. But Penelope Spheris, I believe, was a director, and a woman director of comedy, rare at the time. Very good.
Okay, now you're showing off, Danny. Stop. Your intergenerational cultural literacy is a perfectly fine thing to be proud of, but we get the idea.
Thank you.
This also occurs when we try to reach back into American cultural history for analogs for what we're doing. I mean, do my fellow boomers naturally think of the Andy Griffith Gomer Pyle USMC synergy, the Green Acres Petticoat Junction?
I think it's actually quite similar structurally to punk bands. Like, I think it's very, very similar because it's a very low cost of entry. You don't need a lot of professionalization. That's part of the appeal of it. And you see like people move around in bands and podcasting in a way very, very similar. Like I've been studying punk for this Nirvana podcast that I'm doing. It's really, really similar to like the vibe and the aesthetic and sort of the approach to culture. Really, really analogous, I think.
So you've already got a Nirvana podcast gig going?
Well, TBD, but yeah, I'm doing I did a ton of interviews. I did over 90 interviews for this podcast, and so putting it together and
because I wrote a book about Buddhism, so I'm seeing some synergy right away here.
Stop! I'm actually in a room. My parents created like a little Buddhist room. I thought I was going to tell you about it.
I'm totally.
That's where the good vibes are coming from.
Yeah. So enough about good vibes. There's the world to talk about.
Yeah, let's get into bad vibes.
Nothing but bad vibes.
Nothing. So 2 months on, I don't know what's our state of the war assessment.
Well, Derek could probably give like the pure facts of the matter. Derek, you want to just do like a quick update to situate people about where we actually are in terms of the war?
Sure. I mean, this reaching back 2 months is and telescoping is difficult, but the Israelis are at the point now where they've moved on from northern Gaza City, which was the initial target of their invasion. They've moved on to Khan Yunis, which is one of the two big-ish cities in southern Gaza. There was that interlude last week when they were in a ceasefire with Hamas, and they were exchanging detainees on either side. That fell apart after 7 days. It lasted longer than it was initially supposed to. It was 4 days. They were able to extend it a couple of times, but the extension talks fell apart. The northern Gaza end of this, I mean, I don't know how detailed you want me to be, Danny, but we could, there were the attacks on hospitals. There was the incessant bombardment of pretty much the entire Gaza Strip, uh, amid calls for people to evacuate from the north to the south while the south was still under bombardment. There have been more calls in the last few days from the Israeli military for people to evacuate parts of Khan Yunis, to go to Rafah or to go out toward the Mediterranean coast. They're doing that still under bombardment. The last couple of days, from what I've read, have been some of the heaviest fighting of the war so far. There is an intense push, I think, to root out Hamas commanders. I mean, the Israelis, feel like they've cut Gaza roughly in half, and they're now closing in, presumably, or at least they think, on senior Hamas figures. There's only so many more places that they could be, I guess. They've besieged, reportedly, the home of Yahya Sinwar, who's one of the biggest. He's Hamas's political leader in Gaza. He is not home, I assume.
I would assume,
but they've surrounded his house in sort of a symbolic gesture that they can trying to say that they can get to anybody, I guess. But that's where things stand. There's, obviously the humanitarian situation is quite dire. They are packing hundreds of thousands of people. 1.8 million have been displaced at this point. It's believed, probably more than that at this point. They've killed, the Israeli military has killed somewhere over 17,000. I say somewhere over. That's the official figure, which the Israelis acknowledge. It's the official figure from Gaza's health ministry. The Israelis acknowledge that it's generally accurate. They're killing people at about a ratio of 2 civilians for every combatant, according to the Israelis, which, you can wonder what their definition of combatant is and whether that's a legitimate figure. They've displaced all these people. There's some effort, of course, to get aid in, and we can talk about all these things in some detail, but there's some effort to get aid in. But increasingly, I think the problem now is going to become, even more than the bombardment, even more than the kinetic violence, is going to be disease, because as these people get packed into ever smaller geographic spaces, the same number, essentially, you're talking about 1.8 to 2 million people packed into an ever smaller space with no facilities, no infrastructure, no little aid, some, but not nearly enough to the level of the need. I think disease is going to be the big thing that starts to take root, and that's the next kind of wave of horror here, I think.
Yeah, the current Wall Street Journal homepage headline is about looting breaking out. Not surprisingly. Did you say that the Israelis are conceding a civilian to militant death ratio of 2 to 1? I mean,
Yes.
I kind of inferred that from an estimate of like at least 5,000 militants killed that came from them.
So this was a few days ago. They said that they believe they've killed 5,000 combatants, while also acknowledging that the overall death toll that was being talked about at the time, which was about 15,000, was generally correct. So effectively, yes, they conceded that they're 2 to 1 civilian to combatant death toll. I did see the stories about looting, and I think it's I think that terminology is kind of ridiculous to talk about people under these circumstances as though they're like committing an offense.
Yeah, it's absurd.
Of
it's like
looting.
It's like it's
ghetto.
just, was that looting?
Yeah, I mean it's sort of just, it's more dehumanizing language that would never be applied to any other people
like
in the circumstance, but the Palestinians. Yeah.
Yeah, I saw a picture of people lined up for flour from the UN, and I, so far as I could see, there wasn't any actually coming, no flour, but they were waiting, and there were just thousands and thousands of people in a crowd.
I mean, the aid has been restricted logistically in terms of how much you can bring through the checkpoint at Rafah from Sinai, from Egypt, which is where it's coming from. That's been a bottleneck, but the bigger bottleneck at this point is that there's not enough fuel to distribute aid to other parts of Gaza once it comes in. And now in the last few days, with the intensity of the fighting in southern Gaza, it's been, I think, impossible for even trucks that have fuel to get through those areas and distribute aid.
Derek, have you seen good figures on Israeli casualties? I mean, last I saw numbers, seemed extremely low, which I took to mean that the militants in the north had by and large chosen to either lay low or head south rather than confront them. Although, of course, they're hugely outgunned. I mean, I have,
Right.
the Hamas videos I've seen, and there were only a few at the beginning, and I haven't seen them since. Not surprising, since power is hard to come by and so on. Electricity is hard to come by. But it was just using RPGs against tanks, and it wasn't clear that they were effective, and you wouldn't expect them to be. I mean, you need slightly more powerful weapons to do much damage to tanks.
Yeah, the Israelis themselves say they've lost, I think, 88 soldiers was the last I saw. That may have changed. I think that was a day or two ago, so that may have changed, but it wouldn't have changed by more than 2 or 3, I wouldn't think, barring some serious mishap. But yeah, I mean, there have been these videos that kind of they're putting out for propaganda reasons of Hamas fighters kind of sneaking up on tanks, and they apparently have had a fairly from what we can tell, the Israelis aren't doing a lot of like infantry operations, just having men kind of coming in with the tanks to protect them from just such an occurrence. But yeah, as you say, I mean, I don't know that they're that effective, and it comes down to the sophistication or the kind of power of the weapons that Hamas has available to them.
Mm-hmm. And oh God, where does this end? I mean, last time we talked about the possibility that an eventual upside could be this gets so much attention that something productive winds up happening. Some sort of actual solution, long-term solution to the Israel-Palestine issue. I don't know, but it occurs to me that given the political obstacles to that in various places, including American domestic politics, you just have to imagine something incredibly horrific, right? It's like, what did it take to get the League of Nations started? World War I. How about the UN? Yeah. World War II. Big, heavy lifts, require massive quantities of horror historically, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been pretty clear that there's going to be nothing like that. That the world, whether regional or global, whatever framework you want to adopt, is not especially concerned, or not concerned enough to do something active. But it does seem like there is the biggest shift that I've seen is a genuine difference in generations of Americans toward the U.S.-Israel policy. That seems genuine. That seems real. And I imagine that will actually have medium-term consequences, because I think the strategic argument for the U.S. interest in the Middle East is been waning for decades. And the strategic argument for the U.S. interest in Israel has been waning for decades. Now there's domestic political actors, the famed Israel lobby that Mersheimer and Walt talked about, but more important, the Christian Zionist lobby is still quite powerful. Now that Likud has so actively aligned itself with the Republican Party, that seems to be probably a pretty shitty medium to long-term strategic decision that Netanyahu has made. So that actually does seem like a real shift that will probably be lasting. And there have been moments in American history where the U.S. has been less accommodating to whatever Israel wants. It could be a more normal ally where the U.S. actually exerts some significant pressure, or the nature and tenor of the relationship could change. And you could see Israel looking toward other nations like it had at some points in the 50s.
Yeah, although I think even within the Democratic Party, it's going to be a long time before the politics on balance align in favor of any kind of aggressive approach to...
Yeah, that's gerontocracy, right? I mean, this is a problem with the system. You could talk about this in a million different issue areas, whether it's surveillance, whether it's AI, whether it's Israel. We have these septuagenarians running things. It's a problem, and it's...
I mean, at the donor level, you have a lot of people that old, but I think, even, the age cutoff, I think within the Democratic Party, where you get to a point where, most people are on balance, just wouldn't actively support the kind of things you'd need to get an actual solution to this. I think the age cutoff for that is younger. There's also the question of these younger people, how much do they care? Will their sentiments endure as time goes on? Sometimes people become more conservative as they age.
Yeah, when they get money in houses.
Yeah.
So lucky for us, that's not happening.
And look, I speak as someone who has two daughters, both of whom, as I've mentioned and kind of boasted on Twitter, both of whom have been arrested for refusing to disperse at pro-ceasefire rallies. These were early on in like the Grand Central Station rally and so on. Anyway, I mean, they weren't like fighting cops. It was just a ritual that the police would come and arrest them. And their friends, the vibe I get from them and their milieu is this is quite different from when I was young. But I don't know, a lot of questions. People are raising questions.
Well, I mean, the real question is like, I don't think there's going to be enough to stop population transfer, right? So when this shift happens in 10, 15, 20 years, it might be too late. That to me is the likely outcome if I was
Wait, do you mean there's going to be successful ethnic cleansing before then of the West Bank and or Gaza or what?
Yeah, that's where the trends go, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, well,
I don't see I don't see any major world power getting in the way of that. That just hasn't happened, and like with all the population transfers and movements, I just don't see why that would not happen.
It's already happening in the West Bank, which kind
of
gives the game away.
Ideological. It's just happening.
Right. It's already happening in the West Bank, which doesn't relate to Gaza, but since October 7th, there has been a huge spike in violence, both by settlers and Israeli forces against Palestinians in the West Bank. Like 260 people have been killed. Thousands of people have been arrested. Entire Palestinian communities have been emptied out by settler mobs or threats of settler violence. And the best that the United States is willing to do about this is to, as the Biden administration announced this week, put some settlers on a visa blacklist, which, the fact of the matter is a large number of some of the most extremist settlers happen to be U.S. citizens who have relocated to West Bank settlements and aren't subject to a visa ban. They can come and go from the U.S. because they have passports. And the visa ban, even the spokesperson for the State Department, Matthew Miller, said it probably affects dozens of people. There's a symbolic, I guess, gesture that the U.S. is willing to do this.
That's for the State Department employees. That's my theory of that.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I think it's probably for people who have been critical in the government, but also, looking at Democratic voting blocks in some states, as Danny, you and I have talked about, looking at people who are fed up with the Biden administration because of how it's approached this conflict. It's a concession to them. It's a symbolic gesture that the U.S. is doing something. But even places that haven't been emptied out by actual violence, you've got extremists in the Israeli cabinet like Bezalel Smotrich, who's the finance minister and is also running the agency that manages the occupation, talking about imposing basically security cordons around Israeli settlements that amount to just another land grab. I mean, they're imposing these kind of no man's lands over areas that Palestinians in the West Bank farm, where they have olive crops, their olive orchards, just taking more land, essentially, absorbing it into this, constantly expanding settlement block.
Yeah, the ethnic cleansing thing on the West Bank definitely accelerated after October 7th. Now, for now, they're relocating within the West Bank, which isn't the kind of what a lot of people in Israel, certainly a lot of settlers, would like to see is, of course, them go to Jordan or somewhere, and the Gazans go to Egypt. And I noticed, by the way, that the Israeli military is currently encouraging them to go to the Rafah crossing to be safe. That's pretty close to someplace other than Gaza, isn't it? I guess the one good thing aside from an occasional, worthless rhetoric, what the Biden administration has done about on the West Bank ethnic cleansing thing, they did one thing that surprised me. If I'm right about this, Israel wanted to import a bunch of rifles, just buy them from America. Obama administration or Biden administration said, wait a second, Are these going to settlers? They said, no, we assure you they won't go. They're going to the military. And I tweeted, wait a second, these things are fungible. They can take, rifles in the hands of the military, give them to the settlers, give these to the soldiers. I doubt that tweet was decisive, but last I heard, the administration at least did continue to put a hold on that. That's even that is symbolic, of course. What we need is for Biden to stand up and say shit. And of course, go further out. Right. He's not going to go out and say something that's not ineffectual, because that would be like, listen, we actually have our limits. If the ethnic cleansing keeps going on, or if X keeps happening in Gaza, we're going to have to reconsider whether we want, whether the American taxpayers' money going to fund these weapons. He's just not going to say that. I wondered about like a taxpayer revolt, organizing online people who say, I'm not going to pay my taxes next year or something.
They try that every 30 years. It doesn't work. Like they try to
you yourself said things have changed over the last 30 years.
It's so complicated to do.
Well, I'm leaving it in your hands, Danny. I want you to start this.
It's very difficult to do because that's not the way taxes work in the United States, and it's virtually impossible.
Well, you don't pay them. They can't steal your money. What you need is so many people committing to it that they couldn't possibly put you all in jail.
If Biden loses an election because of this, that's the biggest thing, basically. If that genuinely happens, then everyone's going to say, Trump is a threat to democracy, blah, blah, blah. But in the medium term, if Biden loses an election and it is read as being partially about Israel, that will be the thing that changes U.S.-Israel policy.
But talk about overdetermined. There's so many reasons he's now likely to lose. It
depends how it's read, right? These are all things that history is just one damn thing after the other. The only thing is what is the story that people tell themselves?
Yeah.
If the story that people tell themselves is Biden lost the election because he supported Israel in its war in Gaza, then that will change policy. American foreign policy generally changes for domestic political purposes. It is not this is why it's kind of funny to always hear these IR guys, because they're talk about grand strategy in this great game. But if you look at the history, why did Lyndon Johnson escalate in Vietnam? Because he was worried about his electoral success, the Democratic Party. It's always this local situation. And that is the biggest potential hinge point here, is if Biden loses or if the Democrats lose and it's read as due to Israel, that'll change things. Barring that, it'll be a generational shift at best.
I don't think it'll be read that way. What do you think, Derek?
I guess it could be read that way in several years from now, but I envision if Biden loses, we're going to get another 4 years of people shouting that the left ruined America and destroyed us like they did after 2016. So I don't know when that's going to kick in, because the institutional response is going to be to lash out at the left, as is always
right.
the case
and
when a Democrat loses.
And the Gaza thing puts a twist on the woke mob narrative, which is they'll say it was the particular woke mob that was part of these pro-Palestine demonstrations that shut down Christmas festivities and included demonstrating outside a Jewish-owned restaurant, which is that is an interesting little thing. Needless to say, the story turns out to be more complicated. They weren't just demonstrating because they were Jewish. That said, I didn't think it was a good idea, but anyway, that's one thing that's going to be strongly pushed, and there's going to be so much political power behind the pushing of this narrative. It's like,
yeah, we're fucked. Once again, we're fucked, and things are going to get worse, and that's that.
Okay, folks. Well, listen, we'll bring you another episode soon.
That's happy.
No, we're not done.
Leave you on a good note there.
We're not done. Not nearly.
No, you're totally right. This is the problem, right? The same things keep on happening. Things aren't working out. It was funny. I was on Glenn Lowry's podcast. I don't know if you saw about.
I didn't. I was on it too, and apparently he got some negative feedback about what I had to say on this subject. But I haven't listened to yours.
Yeah. But people were really, really mad. It's just ideology all the way down, right? They criticize wokeness. but then they don't want to be criticized for the exact same thing. It really is just the prison of ideology. It's all the way down. There's very, very difficult ways to do that without material transformation. Everything in this country is basically set up so that there isn't material transformation. This is why liberalism is constantly in crisis, because it won't reform itself, because there's no push. So this is where we are again and again and again and again. It's very frustrating.
So what would the material transformation be? This may be when our paths start to diverge.
I mean, you'd have to do serious redistribution. You'd have to change the structure of the American empire. You shouldn't have 750 overseas bases. You shouldn't have the dollar be a hegemonic currency. You know, you should actually tax billionaires and millionaires. You should actually get rid of things like stock buybacks and dividends. 3 companies shouldn't own 20% of the S&P 500. If you just look at like the whole thing, it's all broken, you know, and if you're not going to change it, then you're just going to get the problem.
Well, yeah, it's like I support most of that, but it falls into 2 categories. There's the overseas empire basis part. I agree with you. There's the redistribute income part. I agree with you. I'm just not so sure that the redistribute income part, even if it were possible, would have a big effect on the empire part. I don't know, maybe.
Well, no, I mean, this is the problem. I mean, the greatest thing the empire ever did was creating an all-volunteer force. We're effectively creating a janissary corps so that we're totally shielded from the consequences of the empire. It was genius. That was a genius move for Congress not to renew the draft in 72 or 73. I always get those dates mixed up for some reason. That was great. So now Samantha Power's kids don't have to fight, but she could constantly talk about the responsibility to protect. It's amazing. What a gamble.
No, that's all true. I mean, there are other unfortunate implications of having an all-volunteer force, I think, as it comes to have increasingly an ideological character. It didn't used to. I grew up in a military family. The Army didn't used to have any kind of pronounced ideological character.
It's interesting. The officer corps is still progressive in the technical sense of the early 20th century. You know, they believe like technology is going to be able to like reform war and change things. And the enlisted men are usually more small c conservative or apolitical. You know, it's a very strange situation we've set up here. And everyone who talks about foreign policy in the blob, very few of them, not all of them, but very few of them have actual connections to war fighting. So you get this very strange thing that's happened, which is kind of unique in history. If you used to talk about war, you used to generally have some experience in it. For most of human history, not anymore.
Well, this is what kills me. I mean, we'll get around to Ukraine shortly, but this becomes relevant there. Like,
well, and it's
Mark
just
Milley,
getting.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I would add to what Danny said. We're well beyond now just the volunteer force. We're into the next cut of this, where we get humans off the battlefield entirely, except for the civilians who get caught in the crossfire. But we've got drones, we've got increasingly unmanned systems. We've got AI now to talk about, potentially, which the Israelis are apparently using to help them, find targets in Gaza, which is the reason they haven't run out of things to bomb, I guess. But it's just another level of removal, like taking this out of anybody's lived experience here in the U.S. without even putting soldiers, lessening the risk to even the members of the volunteer military. It just becomes more of an abstract concern for people in the U.S. and that enables you to do more and more stuff. It costs a lot more, but it gives you freer reign.
And just one more thing, they're all private now. The U.S. military is essentially a training ground for the world's mercenaries. Like this is what we've done. It's all so broken. It's so fucked at every level. It's almost wild to think about when you look at it holistically. Like everything is not, even capitalism isn't functioning like it should. You shouldn't have these incredible oligopolies. You shouldn't have State Street, Vanguard, and BlackRock own everything. It's wild. Is it BlackRock or Blackstone? I always like when I'm talking quickly.
It's BlackRock, I think.
Yeah. So they own everything. Like, what are you talking about? Why do you think airline prices and movie ticket prices have gone up? It's because it's all owned by the same 3 people.
Unless it's not Blackwater, is it? I just want to get clear on this.
No.
Blackwater's the mercenary group.
Blackwater's the mercenary thing. They're
right. Well, so there's a natural nexus here then. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's bad. Yeah, I saw footage of from the West Bank, some Palestinian home and some drone was coming and like demanding that they do something. Some no human being had to get anywhere near them. But it was issuing some warning or something or other. And I'm sure this is one reason the Israeli casualties, as you suggested, Derek, are so low in Gaza. I mean, I'm sure the initial exploration of the tunnels doesn't have to involve any human beings. At least, you can get a certain amount of intelligence without putting people down there. And
they're using robots and dogs apparently to clear the tunnels. And there's been some talk. There was a thing in the Wall Street Journal a couple of days ago that they might start pumping seawater into the tunnels, which would clear them out pretty quickly, but would also foul Gaza's water table, and whatever's left of people's ability to get fresh water would be, and it would flood the sewage system and cause all sorts
salting the earth.
All sorts of wonderful, literally salting the earth.
It's like a biblical crime.
So, I mean, the people who are saying, oh, this is so bad for Israel, and look, I do think it's interesting the extent to which the publicity is negative, not just among the younger generation we talked about, but these main. I mean, look, you look at the front page of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and so on. There is a fair amount of highlighting these days of the suffering of Gazans. Maybe on balance, it's not the balance you'd like. Fine, but my question to you is, though, does any of this matter? I mean, my reading of Israel's kind of collective psychology, obviously a huge oversimplification, has long been that they just assume the world is going to hate them, and take that as a constant, and do what they think they have to do without worrying about that. So I don't know. Do you think that's wrong, or?
Well, they assume that. They also assume that the world doesn't care about the Palestinians. That calculation might be different.
I'm not sure. I mean, I think they think that the sympathy you see for the Palestinians actually originates in hatred of them, in either anti-Israel sentiment or anti-Semitism. I think that's kind of the way they read that. You're emphasizing the things we're doing about Hamas. That must be because you embraced the initial Hamas atrocities.
Sure, but Israel has repeatedly made strategic choices throughout its history on pressure. It's not like this. They could only act that way without pressure, right? Like Ben Gurion and Begin, these were people who made like deals and stuff like that, right? It's just they're only allowed to act in this particular way because they've been given a free hand, because they believe that there won't be any genuine blowback. Right. This even if you're right, like on sort of like when you're at the dinner table, this is how they talk about things. It doesn't really matter. I mean, these are people who have made deals and have made agreements. It's just that the world doesn't care, I think, or doesn't care enough. If you don't want to like paint with that broad of a brush, and I think it's pretty clear, it's pretty right. So this is why it's a pretty grim situation. The United States could change it, but like we've talked about, it seems very unlikely right now.
And Derek, do you think there's any lasting result of the kind of unusual degree of outrage, for the time being at least, about?
I don't. I mean, I think there hasn't been anything that's indicated to me that the outrage or the coverage is changing the way that the Israelis are approaching the war. I mean, we get some lip service, and it's certainly changed the way the Biden administration was talking about the war. I mean, there's a noticeable shift in the rhetoric coming out of the State Department, coming out of the White House a few weeks into this war, where in the initial stage it had been all, we support Israel. We don't believe that the casualties are as high as the Gazans are saying. We're standing with Israel over and over again, until it reached such a fever pitch that they really started to emphasize bringing humanitarian aid in, and we expect the Israelis to conduct themselves according to the rules of war and to preserve civilian life. But it hasn't manifested in any way that I can tell. I mean, there was the ceasefire, but since the ceasefire, we've seen even more intense fighting and less regard, seemingly, for civilians in just the last few days than we saw prior, despite all this talk that, like, oh, the ceasefire is ending, but the Israelis will have, sort of reset things, and they've, they're trying to do more. They're going to do more now moving forward to protect civilians. The only thing they've come out with is this absurd grid map. I don't know if you've seen that, Bob. That they posted on the IDF website, and there's like trying to call people to say, you're in grid 210 and you need to move to grid, 305 or something to get out of the way of the fighting. Like, how are people in Gaza supposed to track this stuff? There's the internet service is like knocked out, cell service is knocked out. Like, what is this if not just a demonstration for a Western audience that we're like doing something, even though that probably has no real impact in Gaza?
Yeah, well, plus Israel's already saying we see missiles being launched from what we've defined as humanitarian relief zones. Well, I think I've got a feeling about what comes next, and it's kind of great to be the people who get to define the humanitarian relief zones, but then bomb them as soon as you say that you see trouble there. Well, listen.
Well, Bob, actually, before I was curious. Why do you want me to read that John Judas? Maybe we could talk.
Okay, we're going to talk about that, but first I should say, both of us, the Nonzero newsletter / podcast, the American Prestige newsletter / podcast, have to make ends meet. As a result, we have both adopted the paywall model. And in trying to figure out when is the optimal time to bring down the paywall for this podcast, Danny and some of his neoliberal friends ran a profit maximizing algorithm. He knows people who know Python or some programming language. And Danny, I think you said like right now, right? That was what you and your
right. This is the exact moment. My friends at Vanguard have just texted me. We should definitely switch over.
I have a McKinsey consultant actually listening on the other line, and they've assured me that this is it.
I'm of course against paywalls. I adopted ours only reluctantly, but I'm going to succumb to the neoliberal imperative that you guys are pushing so hard, and so we will continue. The podcast continues. I want to talk about the John Judas piece in the New Republic on Israel and settler colonialism, whether the paradigm matters. Talk a little more about Biden's politics, whether we can hope that he'll squirm a little more on this issue, and then get into a little bit about Ukraine, because I think we've hit kind of a watershed in American perception of that over the last few weeks. And
only if two geniuses had predicted this years ago, things would have been different.
Oh my God, don't get me started. I'll do my bragging about how right I was on the other side of the paywall, because I know it's a bad look, and we only want to do it among friends, people who
pay
charitably, people who don't mind giving us money. So anyway, but seriously, you'll be supporting two endeavors that we consider worthwhile. You only have to subscribe to one. You subscribe to the American Prestige thing or the Nonzero thing, both on Substack, and you get access to the rest of this and to all of these, what I call overtimes on my podcast, and a bunch of stuff on your podcast. And
and we still have the discounts running, right? So people subscribe to one, they can get the discount on the other.
Yeah. Now, is there an easy way for them to access that?
We have links. I mean, you guys have a link for us, and we have a link for your show that we'll put in the show notes.
So it's all good. So we encourage people. I mean, we thank everybody who's stayed with us this far and isn't going to continue the journey, but we especially thank people who are going to continue the journey. So now we head into overtime.